Hey guys, I'm Kelcey Steele. I'm a director at Primal Screen in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm going to start by giving you a sneak peek at the projects I'm going to be covering today. One is an ID for Adult Swim created to promote season 5 of Rick and Morty, and the other is an ongoing project. It's still in production, and it is a football themed project. The overall theme of today's presentation is organization and navigating complex scenes, so hopefully some of the tips that I'm going to cover will come in handy for you in the future. So just a little bit about me. I'm a director at Primal Screen in Atlanta, Georgia, and Primal Screen is an award-winning creative studio specializing in design and animation. They've been around for the past 27 years, and I've been with Primal full-time roughly for the last 5. I've done several stints as a freelancer during my career, and I was first introduced to everybody at Primal in around 2015. Over the next several years, I did several contracts, and when a full-time position became available, and they asked me if I was interested, I decided to jump at the opportunity. So for my last presentation for Maxon, I actually presented a branding campaign that I created to celebrate our 25th anniversary. So if you haven't seen that presentation, you can find that on Maxon's YouTube channel, and definitely I would love for you to check it out. I started at Primal Screen as a designer, and then I've been promoted through the ranks over the last 5 years to the directorship role that I hold today. So I'm going to play Primal Screen's 2022 reel, and then we can get started.
Just listen to the track, rewind it back. Just listen to the track, rewind it back. Just listen to the track, rewind it back. Just listen to the track. Funk, I got 'em jingling, jangling, jingling, jangling, shingling, jangling. I got 'em jingling, jangling, jingling, jangling, shingling, jangling.
Okay, so I'm going to start out by talking about a project that I directed for Adult Swim. This was to promote season 5 of Rick and Morty. It was a very open-ended project. The brief was very vague. It was just kind of like, pitch us some ideas. If we like it, then we'll say, yeah, go ahead and do it. And this was an absolute blast. I loved working on this project. I did most of the 3D work. I did the modeling. I had some help with storyboarding and with posing some of the characters, but for the most part, this was a project that I kind of took on as like kind of my own pet project. So I'm going to play that for you, and then I'm going to go through some of the organizational things and some kind of workarounds to gotchas that came up along the way. And so this project is actually one of 2. We created 2 different IDs with 2 different approaches. We have one that was a purely 2D approach that's on our website at primalscreen.com. And then also this one, which I thought would be really awesome to take some of the key moments from season 5 and translate those into 3D. It's everything frozen in time. And these are some screenshots from the actual show. This is where the space monster came from. I modeled all of that using the sculpting tools and then using some retopology tools to get it down to a much more manageable polygon count. And here we see Rick and Morty again. They're escaping from the space monster. And this was a lot of fun. I got to use some of Pixel Lab's volumes here. We have this kind of fun space portal with some jugs of ancient wine. This is in Rick's garage. This is a detail shot of that reference. There's a scene where they are decoys, and it has this kind of cool squid ship. And this is the model that I created for that element. There's also a side plot where Rick is turned into this crow character. I would say probably one of the climaxes from the season was the Battle of Blood Ridge, where Rick is reliving a past battle. And the final episode was at what they call the Citadel. This is their mascot, because you can't have Rick without Andy Morty, and this character's name is Andy. Here is a torture wall. These are just some of the screenshots that I pulled. One thing that they were very specific about is there needed to be no nudity, and it couldn't be overly violent, because this was going to air throughout the day, not necessarily at night on Adult Swim, so they needed it to be pretty generic. So all of our characters were fully clothed, even though we are referencing scenes where they're not. And I'm definitely not the first one to bring it up, but I do want to emphasize the importance of being organized and using layers and takes. It made the scene workable, manageable, easy to navigate. It's just, you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not using takes and layers. It let me keep everything in one file, and it still was really easy to deal with. So some of the takes that I set up, I have a take for every shot of the 4 main shots. You can see when I'm going in between my takes, my cameras change. Just what I'm using for that individual shot is in the viewport. If I wanted to do some quick previews, I've got all of my volumes on a separate layer, and I've got all of my materials on a separate layer. So it's really easy to just disable and isolate each of the individual elements. And these volumes obviously they add to render time, so it was great while I was working to be able to disable all of that and just work in a really efficient way. The recurring theme in today's presentation is talking about how you can use instances and references to your advantage to make global changes so you don't have to worry about multiple copies of the exact same material. And you can treat them kind of as master materials. So I'll show you an example of that. I go into my trooper back here, scroll to that in my outliner. I just have one material on this piece of geometry. It's referencing these other master materials, and I'll show you how I have all of those combined. So if I bring up my shader graph for this trooper back, and kind of show you how these things are layered on top of each other. I have a medium brown paint. I'll just connect that to the output. I have a light brown paint. Got this teal glow. And I have my green texture as well. And one of the things that I've done is I'm using these paint materials with a cubic projection so that all of my scratches and things stay consistent across all these different pieces of geometry. So I set those up as cubic, made sure they all had the same size on their cubic projection, and generated UVs from that. Now when it comes to combining some of these different elements, that same cubic projection doesn't work for this black and white texture that I'm using to feed that green material. So what I've done is I've gone into a top view, I've duplicated my tag, changed it from UVW to flat, and then I just right-clicked and generated a UV. Once I had my 2 UV tags, I made sure to name them properly. And then It's as simple as taking this texture and dropping in whichever UV tag I needed in that case. And that allows you to combine different UV tags and different UV mapping on a single object. And this is a little bit older scene, so this is using the espresso type shader graph. But to create a reference, it's the same with the new material and this older one. You just type in reference, and then there are some different options for what you're actually referencing. In this case, we're going to use the default surface. And I can just grab any of these master materials that I want to use and drop that in as my reference object. So if that's now connected to the output, that's going to be the material that renders. And that makes it really easy to update everything at once using this glowing material. So I can just come in and make a single change. And that's going to change for every item that's referencing that same master material. Using reference materials is a really efficient, great way to work. But one issue that's worth noting is that it's also kind of easy to break those references without realizing it. If the material is referencing a master material that isn't assigned to anything in the scene, if you copy and paste that into a new scene, those references are going to break. I can show you that by just taking this one piece of geometry and copy it. And this came up when I was copying each of these elements into my main scene, noticing that some of these references were breaking and not understanding how to get everything into the main scene. So I'll copy this piece of geometry into a new scene, frame that up in my viewport, and it doesn't look like anything is rendering. Even if I go into my alpha view, you can see that it is in fact actually in the scene. But the reason it looks like nothing is rendering is because all of my reference materials are now broken references. So that's just one thing to note. There are a couple of ways to get around that. And one of the ways that I found that worked best was to just take my scene and make sure that there's nothing in it except for the one item that I want to port into my new scene or my main scene. And I just save that out as an individual element in a single file. And then I go into my main scene and I use the option to merge objects. And that worked really well because that kept all of my references intact and made sure that everything imported into the main scene without breaking any of those references. Another valid option to make sure that you don't break your references when moving between scenes is you can create a null. Take all of your materials and just assign them to that null. Now this can be hidden, but you do have something for each of these materials to actually be assigned to. So if you do a collect on your file to get it ready to go to a farm or to share with another person in a different location, that's going to make sure that you don't end up leaving behind any of your reference material. And one last thing that I want to cover on this particular project is that when I collected this file to send it to our render farm, none of my Redshift proxies came over with their materials. They didn't collect with the rest of the scene. And so I had to do some problem solving to figure out exactly how to make sure that I was able to collect all of those materials from the Redshift proxies. So what we're looking at here is this element from the above ground part of the Citadel. And I've got a couple things going on here. I've got a Redshift matrix scatter. I have my main tree, and then I've exported Redshift proxies for these trees as well. And I'm doing this in its own file. I have everything centered at the world origin. So this is at 0, 0, 0. So when I go to export my Redshift proxy, I'm not going to export these lights or this null. Those are the two items that I want to export as my proxy. So I'll group those. And I like to use this plugin. It's called Redshift Proxy Exporter. And that is by Arturo Relcio. I'm sorry, I'm butchering that name. It was only like 10 euros, and it gives you a couple extra bells and whistles for exporting. So I'll just go and change a couple of settings and say selected objects. I'll set my path. And I'm always going to want to do the world origin. That will give me a predictable location for the origin to be exported. Don't need any lights. And it's not animated, so current frame is fine. I'll just hit export. And then I'll hide my original object. And all you can see now is the bounding box from what I've just exported. I'm going to come down and say delete unused materials. I'm going to create a null. I'm going to drop all those materials onto this null. And this is going to be my tree pod materials. I can copy both of those. And for this example, I'll pretend that this is my main scene. And now just copy and paste those in. And the scene is saved into a location where all of these material textures can be referenced. I'm going to create a layer. I'm going to call this materials. Drag my tree pod materials over to this layer by holding down Control. That's going to add all of the materials and the null to this layer. So now if I want to keep these organized and work just on the materials for this tree, I can solo, can hide them from the outliner. And the other thing that I want to do is within my tree pod, if I'd like to see the mesh, I can go to Mesh, disable the bounding box, and instead of referencing the materials from the proxy file, I want to reference by the scene, and that's going to match my name and prefix. So now if I collect this file and send it to a render farm, all of those materials are going to be collected with the file. And that covers the workarounds I came up with to make sure that references don't break and materials are collected properly with proxies and instances in my large, complicated scene. And I'll give you one last look at the final product and move on to our next project. So for this part of the presentation, I'm going to be working with a model that we bought from TurboSquid. This project isn't actually finished, so I can't talk about the client or exactly what its usage was, but this is exactly how this football stadium opens right from the FBX from TurboSquid. You can see all of this geometry. Nothing really has any meaningful name. It's very disorganized. There's some lights in here, so everything is very difficult to see. So I'll start by switching my view into the constant shading mode by hitting NC. And that's going to give me a little bit better look at what the geometry actually looks like. In my case, I didn't need any of this lighting structure, so I'll just start by deleting that out. Just go into my side view. All right. And then if we zoom in here, all these seats have their seat bottoms flipped up. And you'll also notice there is a keyframe on the coordinates. That really confused me when I first started working with this model. So the first step I'm going to do is to make sure that all of this geometry does not have any keyframes on it. So I'll just select everything. I'm going to select all of my coordinates. And I am going to go to animation by hitting the right click. And I'm just going to say delete track. And that's going to remove all the keyframes from all of this geometry. So the first step in replacing all these seats with the seat bottom down, I want to use instances here so that I can just modify one piece of geometry and affect everything in the entire stadium. The way I'm going to go about that is I'll just go into polygon mode. I'm going to select some of these polygons from just an individual seat. And then I can just select everything that's connected by hitting U, W. Now I'm going to split this off by hitting UP. And that's going to give me just one individual piece of geometry that's separate from all of these others that it was connected to. I'm just going to call this seat. And I want to center the axis because I have my preferences set up to orbit around the axis of what I have selected. And since it's way over here, I'm getting some kind of unpredictable orbiting. So I'll use this command, which is center axis 2. And I have this docked in my custom layout just because I use it a lot. You won't have that by default, so you can access this command by going to Tools, Axis, and Axis Center 2. And that's going to put the axis directly in the center of all the points. I'm going to solo this. And while it is a single seat, it is all still one connected object in the outliner. So the command that I'm going to use to separate everything is polygon islands to objects. And I have my global pop-up set up with some commands that I use all the time. We'll just go to polygon islands to objects, but you can also always find that by just hitting Shift-C and searching for whatever command you are looking for. So if I scroll that down, you can see now I have all the individual pieces. Center the axis to all of those. And this is the biggest piece of geometry. It's the easiest to select. So I'm going to use that as the basis of where all of my instances are placed. So I'm just going to group that, and that'll put that piece of the geometry into a null that has the same axis as the geometry itself. Grab these other components. I'm going to call this seat master. And pull that out of that piece of geometry that doesn't have any polygons in it anymore. And I'm going to use a command called unparent. What that's going to do is it's going to remove it from any hierarchy and put it at the top of the scene so it's much easier for me to find. And I have that docked in my layout, but again, you can always just search with Shift-C. And now I have it at the top of the scene, it's easy to access, and it just is going to help me with all of these kind of messy, unorganized pieces of geometry. So I'm next going to create an instance. I'm going to group the seat master, and if I turn this off, you can see that it turns off the visibility on my instance as well. So I'm going to put this into a group, and I'm going to call this instance masters. And that's going to give me something that I can easily search for and keep all of my master objects in this one group. I can hide that, and it's not going to affect the visibility of the instance. So now I can unsolo. Solo all of the chairs, and I'm just going to work with these two sections down here at the bottom for the sake of this presentation. So we'll center the axis, and then I can go into a top view. And we will use that same command, polygon islands to objects. Center the axis on all of those. And I'm just going to go through and select the big pieces of geometry that are easy to grab, just avoiding the armrest. Because what I'm ultimately trying to do is delete everything except for the seat backs themselves. So I've done that in this file. Go back into my perspective view. And because I want to delete the armrest and not the pieces that I have selected, I'll just group those. I can go back into a side view, lasso select, and delete all those armrests. Now I can unhide that group. And here I need to just go through and select just the seat bottoms themselves. So I've got that done. Go back into perspective view, and I'll delete those. Want to unparent this null, like I said, so that it's easy for me to find. I will unsolo that geometry. Now if I middle mouse select this null, that'll select all the children. And I'll select my instance. And I'll go ahead and solo those. And here is the kind of magic command. I don't want to have to go through and hand place each one of these instances. So I'll deselect my instance, and I'll deselect the main null. And here I'm going to use a command called replace with. And what this is going to do is it's going to replace all these seat backs with the instance that I just created. I'll just do Shift-C, replace with. If I double click that, it's going to give me this hand to pick which item I want to replace it with. And it's going to take a minute to calculate, so I'll show you the results in just a moment. All right, that replace with command has had its time to calculate. And what I have now is that an instance of that master that I created in place of all those seat backs. It's also removed the seat backs from the scene. So I'll group those, and I'm going to unparent them to send them to the top of my outliner. Just going to make it a little bit easier to navigate. So we'll call this seat instances. I'm going to make a copy of my seat instances. I'll hide the seat instances. I'm going to make a copy of my master, and I'm going to call this single polygon. Make sure that I have that visible. I'll hold down Shift and create a plane, and that's going to make a child of that seat back. I'll just pull it forward to the position where I'd like my cloner objects to be sitting. I'm going to change this to 1 by 1 on both the width and the height. I'll drag it out of that hierarchy and delete those other parts of the chair. Unsolo this. We'll go to seat instances. I'm going to middle mouse select, so I select all the children and my single polygon. And I am going to solo those. Change the name of this to cloner source. If I middle mouse select now and deselect the top parent, what I'm going to end up with is all of my instances. Those are selected and they're referencing the seat master. So I'll just drag the single polygon version into this field. So now what I have is a single polygon in exactly the position that I want each of my crowd members to be sitting in. I'll right click, connect objects and delete. And we'll just call this our cloner source. And hide that object. re-enable my seed instances and unclone. And I'm just going to use, from the asset browser, there's a motion capture category. We have the model, so I'm just going to use this male puppet. And I'm going to search for sitting and use this chair idle. Now if I frame this in my viewport, we've got our male character and the motion capture data. So we can apply that data just by taking this character definition tag or character solver tag and dropping in the animation. So that's going to pop him into his seated place. This does have the animation. In this case, just for this example, I don't really need that. So I'm going to go into my male character, select the male puppet mesh, and say current state to object. And just connect and delete, pull him out, and delete the rest of that motion capture data. So now I have my single male character in a seated position. I'll reposition his axis. And I'm going to drop him into a MoGraph cloner. I have mine to create a grid by default. So I'm going to unable it or disable it while I make a couple of changes. This is going to be an object. It's going to be random. It's going to be a render instance, and I'm going to clone to the cloner source. I also want to change the distribution from surface to polygon center, and that's going to put my clone right in the center of each of those polygons that I created. I just need to make a couple of transform adjustments. I think it was 270 and 90. Yep. All right. If you want to add some variation and not have quite as dense a crowd, it's easy. You just add nulls into your cloner. And that gives you a lot of control over how dense the crowd is. You can also change the seed and get some variation that way. You can also add some color variation. So what I'm going to do is I will go into my render settings. I'm going to change this to redshift, and that brings up all the redshift contextual options. So I'll create a redshift material. I'm just going to drop that onto my male puppet mesh. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my MoGraph effectors, and I'm going to grab a random. We'll go to the parameters, and we don't want to use any of the transform. We do want to use the effector color. We'll change the blending mode to subtract. And then in my redshift object, I'm going to drop in a node, which is a color user data. We'll go to our presets. We'll change the, we'll choose the object color as our preset. Change the color to white. And we'll solo this node. And now if I go over to my render view, I press play, we'll see that we have all of our randomly colored crowd. Next, we're going to drop in a ramp. We'll feed this into the ramp. If we solo this node, we're going to see just random shades of gray. And I want to use a color layer. I'm going to feed this ramp into layer 1 color, change the blending mode to overlay, and I'm going to use just kind of a medium blue. We can plug this into the diffuse color, unsolo our node, and now we have our randomly colored crowd. I'm not sure why those seat instances are not rendering. those to render instance. Hit play again. And there we go. We've got our instance seats, our crowd with variation, and a lot of control. We can switch out these characters with anything we want, and it's a global change that takes 2 seconds. It also is really easy to disable the crowd while you're working, and that's the setup that I used to populate this stadium. All right, and this is what the stadium looks like fully populated. And it does have a little bit of a drag to it, so in order to keep everything nice and snappy and easy to work with, I did export all of these seats as a Redshift proxy. And I've already imported that. So I'll just temporarily disable my crowd cloner. I'll grab my seat instances. And I've got backups of this saved, so I can go ahead and delete this, enable my proxy, give it just a second to load. I'll come and turn off my bounding box, and I'm going to enable the mesh preview. There we go. And now the scene is very, very light, easy to move around in. And part of the reason that I wanted to set up the crowd this way is I wanted it to be very flexible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my clone source, and I'm going to solo it. And I want to create fans for the second team. So I'll just go into my polygon mode, lasso select about half of these faces, and I'm going to add a selection tag. We'll call this one Team A. Hit UI to invert the selection. Add another selection tag and call this Team B. I can take my crowd. I'll just duplicate that. Take my Redshift material that I created. Change the base color on this color layer. Just make it kind of red. Assign that to my second cloner. So this selection is going to be Team A. And this one selection is going to be Team B. So now I can unsolo, enable my cloners again. And just like that, I have fans for both sides. I can change out these models at any time that I want. And like I said, they're very easy to enable and disable to keep the scene easy to work with. And here we have the same model that we've been working with from before. It's been modified. We wanted to give ours a very professional feeling, so making it a little bit bigger and grander helped really sell it as a professional stadium. I've also added this halo of overhead lights around the perimeter of the stadium. And once I started compositing, I realized that I needed nulls for each of these bulbs. And because I've used instances so extensively, my first instinct was to just go through and start making everything editable. But as I was doing that, as I was making the referenced objects editable, I was breaking the links between my parent or my source objects for all of these instances. So the easiest way I found to create a file that I could export as an AEC was just to middle mouse select all of my instances, right click, and say connect and delete. So now I've got this very long string of material tags that I don't need. So I'll just delete all of those. What I do need, however, is everything that has this light bulb emission material on it. So I can see that polygon selection 3, and I believe that's this tag. I'll double click that. And now I have all of my light bulbs selected individually. Now I can just hit UI. That will invert my polygon selection, and I'll just delete out all the rest of that geometry. So what I have now are all of my individual bulbs. They are, however, one piece of geometry. So I'll do my very favorite trick, polygon islands to objects. Now I have all of my lights as individual objects. I'm going to center their axes. Okay, so I'll just collapse this bit of hierarchy. And now I can add an external compositing tag, which I believe is now called Cineware. Go into my options. I like that it's in the center. And I can just check children. So now if I go and export an AEC file by going into my render settings, going into save, scrolling down and saving out a separate compositing file, this allows me to have nulls in each of the locations for every one of these bulbs. And within that football stadium, we did want to have some flags. And this is one that is from the Pixel Lab collection. It imports as an Olympic. It's great, looks awesome, but it does have a distinct beginning and end. We have the part where the dynamics have not kicked in yet, and it is only 600 frames. And I wanted something that would loop continuously so I could just have it in the scene and never worry about its beginning and end point. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I will take this flag, and I'm only concentrating on the flag itself. I'm not going to worry about the chord at this point. I'll take a copy. I'll hit C. I can delete that Olympic tag and unlock those UVs. And I'm going to add a pose morph tag. This is in rigging tags. We'll go to pose morph. We're going to save points. So then I'm going to add this Olympic in. And I can hide the original Olympic, and when I scrub through, I'm going to have my polygonal version match the Olympic exactly. And the next thing I want to do is bake this down to a point level animation. So I'll bring up my timeline. I'm going to drop this flag, select it, and next I'm going to say functions, bake objects. I want to bake all the parameters, particularly the PLA. I do want a copy, and I'll say OK. So now we have our PLA, and I'm going to call this flag original. And that's the original timing. I'll copy this and call this flag beginning. I'm going to grab the track for the PLA. I'm going to pull this over 300 frames. It's a 600 frame animation. So I'll just pull these over, zoom in and get those lined up. Then I will take another copy, call this flag end, grab its track, pull these over the opposite direction, and then I'll make one more copy. I'm going to add, we'll just call this flag target. I'm going to add another pose morph. We'll also do points. We'll add our original, our beginning, and our end. And now we can hide all of those. So now if I scrub through, that flag end is at 100%, and it doesn't have any keyframes in the beginning. So I'm going to want to pull that all the way down to 0. So now I have my animation from the flag beginning. So I'll come over to about 500 and I'll just keyframe that strength. And at 600, it's going to be all the way up at 100%. So now if I scrub through, I have my keyframes from the flag beginning, and we'll set a keyframe at 100%, go to about 100, and set that to 0. So then it blends pretty seamlessly with the original timing. My beginning and end frames are the same. So again, if I don't want to worry about the pose morph, I'll just pull this into the timeline, grab flag target, and I will bake this once again. We'll create a copy and say OK. Hide that flag target. And now I have a looping flag. You can do this with any kind of banner. And this will just play through and always look like it's got a subtle amount of light wind. So that's going to wrap things up for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Feel free to contact me if you have any other questions or you'd just like to connect. And find Primal Screen on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And you can find me on Instagram at Steele Kelcey, and check out my other work at kelseysteele.com. Thanks, guys.